So before we start fully and I get to interview the guests, I'll just give you a brief introduction about STEER. So STEER was founded 10 years ago to equip schools with a digital dashboard and practical toolkit to proactively safeguard students' well-being and mental health. So what do I mean by that? If you imagine adolescence as a road between childhood and adulthood that young people have to steer, we know that the number of students who are socially emotionally crashing is increasing. STEER set out to equip teachers to act earlier to identify and support students who are struggling to steer before they emotionally crash. Now, we do this by measuring something different to traditional self-reports. You'll be familiar with assessments which ask students explicit questions about things such as bullying, self-harm, or anxiety. And whilst important, these questions present two problems. Firstly, questions like these make it very easy for students to filter what they're going to tell you, which means that some students' risks stay hidden. And secondly, their responses alert you to current risks, which you probably already know about. So the STEER assessment identifies students with hidden or emerging risks by asking a different set of questions, questions which measure how a student is self-regulating or steering four factors foundational to social emotional well-being and sustained academic progress. Firstly, self-disclosure, which is how much students share or keep private what they're thinking or feeling. Secondly, their trust of self, how much students trust or question themselves. Thirdly, trust of others, how much students trust or question other people. Fourthly, seeking change, how much students seek or limit change. Most students will steer these four factors in a healthy way, making wise choices dependent on who they are or what they are doing. But some students struggle, which increases their risk of crashing. Knowing who they are and what they are struggling with early enough enables teachers to be proactive, preventative, and precise, and give the right student the right signpost at the right time. So we're not just stopping students from crashing, we are teaching them to steer, and it's such an important skill for life, both in and out of school. So what will STEER enable teachers to do? So 5 things. 1, hear every student's voice, every term, every year through a 10-minute online assessment. 2, to build a longitudinal narrative of each student's social emotional steering from the age of 8 to 18 years. 3, prioritize students with emerging or hidden risks, both in and out of school. Fourthly, write targeted action plans to reduce the risk and teach healthy steering. And fifthly, to measure what impact those plans have had. So in order to illustrate that, I'm going to ask a set of questions that have been very recently sent to me by my colleague Robert, who's not here. And I'm going to start by asking a little bit about the roles that our guests have in their school. So, Amy, could you tell me a little bit about your school and your role?
Sure. So we are Stamford American International School from Singapore. We are a really large school comprising of 3,400 students, ranging from pre-nursery all the way up through to grade 12, which is from 6 months old all the way up to age 19. We have over 50 nationalities at our school, and we've been using STEER AS tracking for the last 5 years. Christy, who is one of our panelists today, is our middle school deputy principal and our divisional safeguarding lead. Mark is our Dean of Students for the preparatory course for secondary in our school, and my name's Amy, and I'm the Dean of Students for high school in our school.
Thank you very much. And can you explain how you introduced STEER tracking to your school?
Yeah, we did it as a pilot in 2019. So we started with one cohort of grade 9s. And then as we progressed through STEER tracking, we added one grade level per division every year. So we now have 10 grade levels which are completing STEER tracking from grade 3 all the way up to grade 12. We began only by collecting data. So for our first pilot, the students went through the assessment twice a year, and we didn't put any action plans in place for the first year, just to look at how the kids responded to the conceptual questions that were asked, and then what data we saw from that. To begin with, only our senior leadership team and our heads of grades were trained, and they were the only people that could look at the data. Now all our staff are trained for everyone who works with kids. The majority being our advisory teachers, so our homeroom teachers, all the way through to coordinators and academic and college counsellors as well. We implemented Take the Wheel last year with our first cohort of students, and they were actually our pilot grade of students as well. So when they started in grade 9, they've had a plethora of data to use when they did Take the Wheel as well.
Thank you very much. I should just point out this time, any guests on the webinar, if they have any questions, then please type them in and they can be answered as the webinar continues. So now to Christy. How is the assessment different from other wellbeing surveys, would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll talk about a couple of ways that it's different. And then I'm also going to have Mark contribute to this one and explain a little bit about a unique language learning program we have and why this assessment works in that setting quite well. So while the company that makes the assessment, Steer, is UK-centric, the assessment is not UK-centric. As Amy mentioned, we have quite a diverse population of students in our international school from all over the world. It was really important to us in choosing a well-being survey that we were able to have it be culturally relevant and appropriate, and we feel that this one is. Like you mentioned, Trevor, it kind of uncovers some hidden risks by using those question types that are not explicit questions, which we find in other kind of mental health or social emotional well-being surveys. We also appreciate that longitudinal aspect where it tracks kids over time. We also use some other tools that do sort of more in the moment assessments, but we really appreciate the longitudinal data for our students. And I'll turn it over to Mark to add some information about language.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Yep, thank you, Christy. So yeah, as Amy said, I'm part of the preparatory course for secondary, which is predominantly Mandarin speaking students. And so a lot of time is spent helping them to understand the vocabulary behind the platform. But I think the way the platform is set up is very easy and user-friendly. Our students familiarize themselves very quickly with the platform. And when they have used it in that initial assessment, when it comes to using it again, they understand how to use it and why they're using it. There is an introductory video that Steer provides the school. It's 1 or 2 minutes long, and again, it's very straightforward. It's very easy to follow, understand. And yeah, again, going back to what you said earlier, Trevor, it's our students, as English isn't their first language, they're very often quick to say, yeah, I'm okay, and don't really want to dive deeper into how they really are feeling or the things that are going on in their backstage. And so AS tracking has really helped with that, identify ways of or students that are maybe needing that extra support. So yeah, it's been, as much as they complete the assessment in English, it is very accessible and easy to follow and use for second language speakers.
Brilliant, thank you. And I certainly found that we were in virtually every continent in the world, and schools agree very much with you that there is no cultural bias and the children can understand it. A question now for you, Christy. Which staff are involved and how did you train them?
Yeah, so Amy touched on this a little bit in the beginning. We kind of started small, and then we've built out to the point now where every teacher who's in charge of students does the modules for training. We chunk those out over time. So we'll do I think there's 3 that you kind of need to understand. What is the assessment? What is the point of it? That kind of thing before the kids take it. And then once we have the data, we take them through the data training modules and then the action plan module. So we kind of chunk it out over time. The modules are quite short, easy to understand. We've done them independently. So we've asked teachers, to take time to do them independently. We've done them in a group staff meeting. We've kind of taken a few different approaches depending on the year. But it's important to us that all of our teachers who interact with kids on a daily basis and all of our leadership have access to the data and understand how to use the data. One thing that's been very helpful is that we're a large school. We have, some great resources, including a digital learning director who built a data dashboard for us. Has all kinds of academic learning data and that sort of thing on it, but it's also able to import some basic AS tracking data. So we've got the platform, which is very thorough in its representation of every student. You guys will get to see some of those slides in a few minutes. But also now we have that kind of quick snapshot of every student. So we're trying to build AS tracking into the vocabulary for our teachers on a daily basis.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So if we move on to slide 2, and the question for you, Mark. So what does the data give you that other surveys might not?
Yeah, so here is this, what you can see in the slide is how teachers or advisory or head of grades, whoever is that is checking the data, this is the data they see. And so through the modules, through the training that we do, we are shown or told what this means and how to use it and how to identify students that are high priority. And then on the left here, you can see the little red flags. Those are showing that students are priority students, and those are the students that we should be looking at or focusing on first as a department or as a team. And then the green tick next to it shows that we have looked at them, that there has been an action plan put in place. But when it comes to looking at the data itself, again, it's something that we mentioned earlier. It helps, or it provides teachers and advisory teachers the opportunity to see students that maybe they wouldn't identify as needing extra support or potentially high risk students in the classroom, because of the way that the questions are worded or the way that it's explained to the students. It helps identify those students that do need that help, even if they don't really want to, they're not forthcoming with that information. Another way that I've seen it used in PCS, the program that I'm working in, is that it sometimes does also connect and solidify observations that we have in class. And so it's not always surprising when students are priority students. It's sometimes as that we've had those discussions with our teams. And so AS tracking is another great way of just reaffirming that and showing us that, yeah, those students do need that extra support. And then again, later, Amy and Christy are going to be speaking more about the plans that come from this platform. But yeah, this is where we start, and then we can identify and move forward with creating those individual action plans or cohort action plans and really supporting our students as they move it forwards in the school.
Yeah, I think it's always nice that when a student's identified, sometimes it confirms what you know, and then you can then help the child. But it also, as you said, does reveal those child that are hidden from the system. So there's evidence that it works in both ways. So what do you do with the data once it's in, the trends, the report writing, and allocating the time? That's a question for you, Christy.
Yeah, and that's a great question because, as a pastoral lead in the school, in any school, time is always the most precious resource. And so we've had to, like every school, think really carefully about, it's great to have data and then what, right?
Yeah.
So the approach we take, because we're a large school, we have large pastoral teams. And so we have multiple heads of grade at each level. And then pastoral leaders like myself, Amy, and Mark. So we use the data at that level first, sort of big picture. Let's identify trends. Let's look at groups of kids. What's surprising, what confirms what we already know, and how might that impact our work as a pastoral team, specifically when it comes to curriculum, because we have a social emotional curriculum. And so there are some indicators in the data that would lead us down, particular paths with that curriculum. If let's say lots of students were coming up as being low self-disclosure, meaning they're not really willing to share with adults, we build in some opportunities for that to happen in the social emotional curriculum. And then we narrow down sort of the data set because there's a lot of information by grade level, and we give that to our advisory teachers, our homeroom teachers, and they work on focusing on those priority pupils. So that red flag that Mark pointed out. And then on average we have a cohort sizes of about 200 to 220 in the secondary school. They're quite large cohorts. We get about 30 to 40 priority pupils. For us, that has been too many to create an action plan for it, right? Because then and there's 3 grade levels in my division. That's a lot of action plans to be written. So we've narrowed it down to students who've appeared as a priority student over more than one assessment, so that we know that there is a reason that this child would need some particular attention. So the pastoral leads kind of do that work, preparing individual homeroom teachers with to look at the data, and then we use our grade level meeting time. The teachers of a certain grade level have a set aside meeting time for working together around kids every week, and we use that meeting time to actually understand the data for a priority pupil and write a plan for a priority pupil.
Thank you. So if we just delve into action plans a little bit more, can you tell me a little bit more about action plans, how long they take to write? Are they easy to implement? Are they practical, and who actually writes them? That's a question for Amy.
I think as the program and the platform has increased over time, action plans have got much easier to write. I think the way that we look at the data and the amount of data that we have, the process of getting an action plan together has become easier over time. And like we said at the beginning, when we first started implementing this, it was only our heads of grade and admin that were doing this. And now we've launched it out to our whole school. In the high school, we do it a bit differently from middle school, like Christy had just said. We get every advisor or homeroom teacher to write at least one action plan. So right now in our high school, we have over 60 action plans that have been implemented. And that goes from anyone that works with students on a regular basis, and if they were a priority student. So a priority pupil is someone who has a polar bias in 2 of the 4 factors or more. So it's either polar low or polar high, or if they've got a polar bias in one of the other factors as well. So once a student is identified as a priority pupil, you'll see a screen like this when you click on their name. So for this case study of the pupil, they have 2 polar bias and risks. They have low self-disclosure and low trust of others. And if you can look really closely, the trust of others already has a check mark. So that means that they've already had an action plan written about that polar bias in the past. So for this case study, we're going to choose the polar low self-disclosure. So Christy, if you could go on to the next slide, that would be good. So once you click on the polar bias, it tells you a bit more about what you would see from a student. So it tells you about what the risks might be. So for this one, it would be learning risks, social risks, or mental health risks. And on the top left-hand bar, you can also see where they've tracked over time on how many times they've taken the test. So for this one, it would have been the student's first test, so we only have 1 data point. It also, on the bottom left, it tells you what questions were asked, which link to low self-disclosure, and then what the student has answered as well. So the questions aren't specifically going to target what that bias is. It's more conceptual in the language that's being used, which helps for the students not to be able to try and cheat the system. So they don't actually know what they're being asked about and what the program is looking for. They're just answering it in a conceptual nature for themselves. What else is really good, if you look at the bottom right-hand square, it'll tell you things that you can look for as a teacher, and what behaviours this student might be presenting if they are low self-disclosure. If you go on to the next slide, Christy. If you click on that, it also gives you a lot more in-depth information about what you might see and what these might relate to in terms of learning risks, social emotional risks, or mental health risks as well. And if you go to the next one, it also gives you an indication of how the student might be feeling as a person, what it might be like to be them with this low bias as well. In terms of action plans can take between 5 and 10 minutes. They're really quick to complete. And it's really helpful because the programme gives signposts of what you might see as a teacher, and then you're able to check off as many as apply to the student that you're writing the action plan for as well. From what you check off as a signpost, the programme then generates a list of strategies that ask you if you would be willing to do. And you're picking one goal and one strategy that you're going to look at with that student for your time frame. So for us, we do our first assessment around September, October, and then we implement action plans in November, and then our second assessment isn't until February. So we have about 4 to 5 months to be able to implement those strategies. And then when they take the second assessment, you should be able to see whether there's been any change or not. You're then asked who would be in charge of completing the action plan. We always say if the advisor is going to write the action plan, then they should be the one in charge. Sometimes there are other people that can supplement that integration of the strategy as well, like our social emotional counsellors or our heads of grade or our dean of students. We just ask that advisors ask those people if they're okay with being in charge of implementing those strategies before they put themselves down as the point person. And then it asks you for when you think that this would be reviewed by, and we give everyone the same date that they'll review it, and then we give time in team meetings to be able to generate the action plans and review the action plans as well. And you'll see if any impact has been made when the student retakes the assessment, so whether it's assessment 2 or assessment 3.
Yeah, it is really important to see the impact of that plan longer term. And so what extra information is the data giving you?
So you're able to see information about individual students, but you're also able to see what trends you may see across a grade level or across a division or across the whole school. So if you look at this slide, then the lighter yellow is how students are steering outside their school, the darker yellow is inside their school. So we would look predominantly at the darker yellow when we're looking at cohort action plans. So for this one, you would see that there's a lot of students that are steering with low self-disclosure and low trust of others as well. You can also look at the trends in composite biases. Christy, if you go to the next one. So from this, you can see that inside school, we have a lot of students who are over-regulators. So that means that they're either putting on a mask so that they might be struggling on the inside, but they need to be perceived as a high achiever, or they're just students that are really diligent about behaviour as well. When we create a cohort action plan, you go into the programme just as you would an individual action plan. If you can go to the next slide, Christy. Just instead of ticking the individual student action plan, you would click on cohort action plan, and that would allow you to create an action plan for, we do it by grade level, but you can do it by division or by 2 grade levels, just whatever your cohort would be. You just need to select that to filter the information at the top. If you can go to the next slide, Christy. So this, you follow the same process as you would an individual action plan, where you're given those signposts and you click as many as are relevant, and then you're also given the strategies based on those signposts. It's really important that when you create a cohort action plan that you let the teachers who teach that cohort know what strategy you're using so that everybody can implement that at the same time. And that's the best way to see if that strategy has actually had any improvement in whatever the polar low or polar high is for your students. So everyone is in charge of implementing one strategy to see if that has had any effect, and then you'll be able to see the impact when the test is retaken again.
Okay, brilliant. And we hand over to Christy now.
Yeah, so I wanted to share a little bit about the safeguarding feature in the survey. So This sits alongside the data around each bias for students. And similarly, you can look at individual students, you can look at groups of students. So we have implemented this into our safeguarding processes in each division. So I am the middle school safeguarding lead. And so when we meet together to discuss our open safeguarding cases, we pull up the data from this survey to see what is it telling us about this student. Sometimes there's a link and sometimes there's not, right? So we might know of students who are struggling with their mental health in some way that this hasn't picked up. It's actually usually the other way around, that the system is the survey is flagging more students than we are aware of. And so that makes it a really powerful tool to identify safeguarding risks that we might not know exist because we haven't asked before in the right way. So the way that we are using it for those unknown to us cases is our counselors and our team, our safeguarding team, kind of look through those flags in the system and are able to identify. You can see the kids who have more than one red dot means that they've essentially been showing up for multiple assessments with a safeguarding risk. Once you have identified a child, it actually gives you some questions to ask yourself about the child, or to have a discussion with the child if our counselor was going to do that, that might get at what the risk they are presenting with is showing. We found this to be very helpful because there are quite a few students that would be unknown to us otherwise, who are silently struggling with some mental health struggles that we are able to support them with once we know about it. It gives direction and questions. There's a bank of resources there for our counselors to use, which they've also found quite helpful. Probably similar to other schools, we've seen an increase in mental health struggles in the last 18 months in particular. And so this is another layer of information that allows us to address risks. So this particular child would have come up with social naivety, which essentially means they have a hard time understanding what's happening in the social world around them. And these are some of the risks directly related to what we would call a safeguarding risk. They're a risk in the school environment, but they're also a safeguarding risk. And so this is just a way of drawing our attention to that.
And so the next question is, how can you assess the impact of the plans? Because it's about the children and advising them how to emotionally steer. So
yeah, absolutely. So the nice thing about the database is that it assesses your impact for you. And so we don't have to do our own sort of guessing or calculating. That's why it's important that the data is longitudinal and that the students take the survey several times a year, because it does allow us to assess our impact pretty straightforwardly. So you'll see circled in red there, both the cohort action plan and the student action plans have been assessed for their impact. We didn't, in this particular one, there's not a group action plan or family signpost, but if you had done those, there would be an impact assessment there as well. Before every round of the survey, we have the teachers review the action plans that they've written directly about individual students and think around their impact, and they're able to do a review in the system. So we do that before each new round. The overall goal here is that students have a reduction in polar bias. So individual students, but also overall as a school, because we've made both individual action plans and cohort action plans, so we're impacting at two different levels. Overall, the polar bias should be dropping. And we've seen that every year that we've implemented the assessment, that over a school year, we have a reduction in polar bias.
brilliant.
This one is challenging for me to read, but I think so this is an example of the numbers would show, if you are able to read them, a reduction in the polar bias. Red indicates a polar bias. You're looking for a reduction in the overall percentage. And you can see that the yes is all of those students have been impacted positively by their plan, with a positive impact. I
Brilliant.
think Amy's going to talk about Take the Wheel before we conclude.
Yeah,
Yep.
very much so.
So Take the Wheel's one of the add-on programs from STEER. So it's for older students in grade 11. So this allows students to see their data and understand the data from all the tests that they've been taking all over time. What's really good about this program is it's a 40-minute experience where STEER teaches them about the terminology that's been used and about the polar biases that we've been able to gather data on throughout the time that the kids have been taking the assessment. It gives them a summary of their data and allows them to reflect on their STEER journey so far. So it'll tell them about the polar bias, and then it'll give them access to their data on that bias, and they'll be able to write a little commentary about how they feel about that data as well. The way that we implemented it was that advisory teachers took them through what the programme looked like, and were there to answer any questions that the kids may have throughout that time as well. The resources that STEER gave us on the website allowed us to make a PowerPoint presentation for the advisors to show, and it allowed them to feel comfortable throughout that process as well. So students were allowed to see their journey, especially last year's cohort who had been doing it from grade 9 all the way up to grade 12. They were able to see how they were steering all the way through those 4 years. And I think what's really good about this is the kids are the only people that see their reflections and their data over time throughout the Take the Wheel process. And what the kids have said is that they like to see what has happened throughout the years where they've been taking the test, and they're able to pinpoint, oh, that's when I did design and I didn't really like design, and that's why my emotional well-being wasn't great at that point, or this is when this happened and that's why the data looks like that. So they're able to look at the data and be reflective on it and analyze it pretty well as well.
Yeah, it's brilliant. The ability for them to see when they struggled and the fact that they've recovered from that struggle is a marvelous gift to be able to give them. Could we stop sharing the screen now so we can see all the participants? Is that okay?
Yep.
My first leading my webinar ever, so thank you very much for being wonderful guests and answering those questions, and thank you very much for the time and effort you put into the care for the young people at your school. It's lovely to see as you've gone through that how well you understand the system and how well you've used it. So thank you very much in that indeed. Thank you very much for our guests on the webinar. Thank you for your time. We will follow up with a recording for those who've attended. But once again, thank you very much for attending this webinar and being interested in STEER. Thank you very much.